Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of American cultural history. In the previous lecture, we talked about upper class sport in the years around the turn of the century. And in this lecture, we'll now turn to a discussion of sport for the middle classes in that same time period. We've talked in previous lectures about the rising middle class, particularly in the antebellum era, which consisted of professionals, shopkeepers, clerks, farm owners, and craftsmen. These were generally self-made men, to whom time was a precious commodity. To a middle-class man, work itself was an expression of manliness, so sport was really not necessary in that role. Middle-class men generally hated the upper-class sporting elite. They saw them as wasteful and extravagant, which was exactly the point, as we discussed in the previous lecture. Middle-class men also generally spurned the bachelor subculture of the lower and working class, with its blood sports, violence, and gambling. So it's in the middle class that we find most of the social reformers of the era, steeped in Protestant traditions and preaching against time-wasting and debilitating activities. All of these trends only continued in the decades after the Civil War, and in fact escalated as the middle class grew with the proliferation of office-type jobs, middle managers, lawyers, and other professionals. For these folks, control was key, and disorder was considered sinful. It is out of the middle class, for instance, that comes the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, formed by Henry Bergh in 1866, principally in opposition to animal baiting and blood sports. Similarly, the creation of the Society for the Suppression of Vice in 1874 sprang up in opposition to gambling in sports. So it may be somewhat ironic that the principal sport associated with the middle class was harness racing, which was often associated with gambling and wagering, and so on. Harness racing was not as expensive as thoroughbred racing and the equestrian sports of the elite, and the horses and buggies were accessible for the not-so-super-wealthy. It was also an urban sport, often with races thrown together spontaneously in the streets. Now, eventually, harness racing was co-opted by the wealthy, who began to scientifically breed the top horses, to buy up the best horses, fine-tune the equipment, and price out the middle class. In general, the middle class needed to be convinced of the positive influence of sport. And so it was primarily the middle class who bought into the positive sports creed that evolved in the country in the post-Civil War era. Sport came to be seen as a mechanism for controlling the immigrant masses and solving social ills, along with many of its other positive qualities, which we'll be discussing shortly. And finally, middle-class men turned to sport as many of their professions turned away from physical vigor and towards white-collar work in this era. And again, this is the crisis of masculinity we've discussed several times already. As the post-Civil War era moved on, the bureaucracies associated with the city grew, and many middle-class men became office workers rather than entrepreneurs or skilled tradesmen. So they needed an outlet to prove their manliness, and in many cases that became sport. Even worse was the trend towards feminization in the office job force, as women came to be hired as secretaries and clerks, and so middle-class men simply had to defend their manliness and separate themselves from women in some way. The middle classes developed their own sports clubs, though not as exclusive as the elite clubs. Membership dues were low, if any, and restrictions were even lower. These clubs tended to revolve around team sports. Cricket was the first, and was especially popular in the 1840s. Eventually, the time requirement of cricket led most middle-class men to prefer baseball, and the clubs developed the first baseball teams. Baseball was a largely middle-class undertaking until the late 1800s, when higher profit potential led lower-class immigrants to aspire to the sport, and team owners more inclined to hire the best players, regardless of social origin. Middle-class clubs also formed around other sports, including track and field, cycling, and target shooting. Cycling became a major fad sport in the 1890s, particularly with the introduction of safety bikes with two equal-sized wheels, as well as inflatable wheels that made for a safer ride. Some 400,000 bikes were sold in 1895 alone, and this contributed to the proliferation of paved roads in some cities. And finally, even sports like tennis and golf became popular with the middle classes by the end of the 1800s, and particularly with the introduction of municipal tennis courts in the 1880s and a few public golf courses in the 1890s. But it would really be several decades beyond that before these sports became truly democratized. Now, what about sports for middle-class women? The women of the middle class struggled the most to overcome Victorian ideals. If upper-class women were above reproach, and some lower-class women simply didn't care about their reputations, middle-class women were held by the strictures of Victorian ideals. Wives were considered separate from men and should focus on raising children and keeping an upright and godly home. Women struggled to overcome the objections of many so-called experts who doubted whether women should participate in rigorous activities. One such critic was Dr. Arabella Keneally of England. Keneally believed that women had no place in sport. She wrote in 19th Century Magazine that women had limited constitutional capital, and it would be squandered by exercise. She also argued that the values taught in sport were appropriate for the business world, but not the home. And she also noted that athletes tended to be single, on the path towards becoming the old maid or the spinster. There were many others who shared her concerns about the safety and healthiness of sport. But others argued that exercise was necessary for women to avoid becoming overly frail and fragile. So many people promoted light gymnastics, stretching, calisthenics, and similarly kind of modest sports and activities for women. But even proponents of exercise warned that women must show moderation, for too much exercise, and especially competition, might damage their reproductive organs. They also believed that women were not capable of handling the mental stresses of sport, that they might suffer nervous breakdowns or become seized by fits of uncontrollable sexual urges if they got too worked up on the fields of sport. So, exercise and sport walked a fine line between offering health benefits to women and breaking them, in the view of these reformers. A few sports were considered acceptable for middle-class women, including horseback riding, side saddle only, sledding, ice skating, and croquet. Evening skating in the park under lights was a very popular activity, and a skating fad emerged in New York City in 1858 to 59 when Central Park opened its pond for skating. In the late 1860s, the pond reportedly averaged more than 20,000 skaters per day, including 2,000 women, when the weather was permitting and the ice was good. By the late 1890s, other sports were increasingly accepted for women, including cycling, tennis, and golf. Now, occasionally, women broke the norms of the day and played vigorous sports, risking ridicule and insult. One of the most famous was Alta Weiss from Ohio. She was the daughter of the town physician. In 1907, at age 17, she joined the men's semi-pro baseball team and played against the men. She wore a gym suit and long skirt, and shedded the skirt the following year, wearing largely men's clothing. In her first season, she defeated one of Cleveland's top semi-pro teams. Alta paid her way through college and medical school by playing against the men. Nonetheless, we have to concede that examples like Alta Weiss were very rare among middle-class women in this era. In future lectures, we'll talk about advances in women's sport after the turn of the century, but for this period, it was still rare. In the following lecture, we'll talk about working class sport in this same era.